5 of the 6 WCC teams in the postseason have had their seasons ended. The portal is alive and well. Welcome all into the unofficial WCC Hoops podcast. I know it's been a little bit of a delayed reaction here. No, that is not because I've been mourning the end of the season for St. Mary's or anything else. Had to deal with some personal issues that took over the last week or so, but back at it, going over what we saw from the tournament a little bit, and we won't dive into too much detail about the games themselves as it's been a little bit of time now. We'll talk about a little bit of the recaps for each of the postseason teams. Obviously, one is still left. Oregon State will be playing in the college basketball crown beginning tonight. And then, of course, the portal and all that has happened because no WCC team has been untouched by the portal. All 11 teams have had at least one player enter the portal, some more significant than others. We've talked a little bit about some of those names in the last episode, but we'll dive a little bit more into the full list of players in this one. But before I get there, because the season has come to a near close, because the Final Four is this coming weekend, I did this last year, and I feel like it always is something to remember, to reflect upon, and think about as the college basketball season ends, because this sport and the way the postseason happens, whether that be March Madness, the NIT, or whatnot, it is unique, and because of its uniqueness, because of the number of things that kind of come into play here, it does make the entire thing special. And I think about March Madness in general on the grand scope of like, yeah, you can talk about the games, you can talk about the wins and the losses, you could talk about the upsets or whatever else. But there's something about this tournament that and this sport that does make it different from a lot of the others. And first and foremost, I think a lot of it is there's a camaraderie that comes with college basketball fans, because to an extent, while it does have national attention and everything else, very often this feels like a niche following, a niche sport, and the fandom that comes with that is different than I think a lot of others, whether they be professional or even other college sports, because it's not just about your team necessarily. It is about the sport. And as many of us, and myself included, would say, like, March Madness, especially the first weekend, is the greatest sporting event that there is. The excitement that comes with it, the ups, the downs, the highs, the lows, the excitement, the despair, all of that comes in the college basketball postseason. Even if you want to like wind the clock back to the conference tournaments, because all of this adds to that level of excitement. And I think that is something that I always want to reflect upon and never want to take for granted, because I've been on a number of these postseason trips. And yes, being a St. Mary's fan, a lot of those don't last very long. But there's something to be said about the people who make the trip, the teams that you have access to, the different environment and setting that the postseason is. And it to me, it does feel like it binds the fandom together more closely. Like, if you travel for the NCAA tournament, you run into fans of other schools and other teams, and you get to kind of celebrate it all. Now, obviously, you're not going to celebrate necessarily with the team that you're playing in that little bubble, but there's more than just you in that pot. There's 8 teams in each of the first round sites. So there's any number of connections that you can make with those fans, with those with the people who come and travel to these games. Because again, a lot of the times, like, the ones who travel are the most dedicated. They are the ones who are there through the thick and the thin, the the good and the bad of your team. And so there is a deeper connection that can be made there. And yes, like the excitement of getting your name called on Selection Sunday, the excitement of going on the trip, the anticipation of the game. If you win a game, the excitement of that. And then you get 2 days to really kind of relish and celebrate that one while you prepare for the next. And in the case of both Gonzaga and St. Mary's, obviously both of them won their first game. So there is that immediate excitement, immediate rush of energy that you advanced in the tournament, in a tournament that we know can be so chaotic. And then when you get to the end, whenever the end comes, even as the clock runs down, even if it already seems like the game is over, there is a different level of suddenness and just almost emptiness once it is over. Once the clock hits 0, once the season is over, it does hit different. And the finality of it, the suddenness of it, even if it looks like it was going to be that way for a while leading up to the final buzzer, there is that reflection, almost immediate reflection, that connection back to your fans, your school, your team, on how the season all went and how special the run was. And I think, again, there are 365 college basketball teams. Only one of them ends the season with a win, or I should say, like, only one ends up the national champion. Everyone loses along the way. And you can't underestimate or undersell how special the postseason runs are. If your team has a postseason run, even if it wasn't the NCAA tournament, the USF Santa Clara, I'm thinking about the two of you, of that, even getting back to the NIT is still an accomplishment as you build the program, as you start to make steps forward. And I know Santa Clara has aspirations for the NCAA tournament and not making it in the way they did, which we kind of knew probably back in December because of the losses they picked up. But you have to think about at least in the program sense, the long-term outlook of what they've built. They built a really good program at Santa Clara. And yes, there was a lot of seniors on that team, a couple of key transfers that have hit the portal already, but they had building blocks. And the mark of a great program is what you're able to do after that. So you can take the highs of the postseason, the lows of it ending, hell, even the lows of the portal, but remember that there is always the hope, if you think you're pointing in the right direction, that the program was pointing in the right direction, that it isn't rebuild, it is retool. And the portal does allow everybody to retool pretty quickly in this day and age. So even those who maybe had their season end in a disappointing way, and even if the portal seems like it might be taking a larger toll than you thought, there's always hope. And if you want an example, just look at St. Mary's a year ago, what the portal looked like for them and at the beginning, and what it ended up being in a season where they were better than they were a year ago. And nobody thought that would happen. So the postseason, the college basketball season, is special in a lot of ways. Like, interacting with a fair number of you who I've been able to meet on the road or on travel or just connecting over social media. This is what makes it fun for me. This is what keeps me going as I get to talk to more and more of you about college basketball, because it is something that we all share it. It is something that we all have a shared experience in. And whether you are a fan of Gonzaga or you're a fan of Pepperdine or Pacific, there's something to be said about how this sport has given us so many exciting moments over the years. And as we enter this what is going to be a very interesting year in the WCC, a year where we add one more team in Seattle. It's the last year of at least 3 of the current WCC teams, Washington State, Oregon State, and Gonzaga. What is this summer going to bring us? What is the summer going to look like? And the one thing I keep looking at, the one thing I keep thinking about this is that the uniqueness, the specialness. I know the portal, I know NIL has taken maybe some of that feeling away for many. But I do think that the WCC is one of the conferences where it can still hold on to a good amount of what many fans looked at as being the good of collegiate athletics, because the WCC isn't directly involved as say the power conferences in the big time NIL money. Not to say that obviously WCC schools aren't impacted by that, but I think there's a lot to be said about that. This is a conference that it can still hold true a lot of the maybe what the purists like about college athletics. All right, so let's get all into what the portal is bringing. So I'll get to the recaps in a little bit, but I do want to start off with this because the portal, the portal has not been kind to a lot of WCC teams. There have been, I think it's now 48 different names have entered into the portal, some of which have already actually committed to other schools. So rather than me going name by name or analyzing one by one, I'm going to go through the entire list as quickly as I possibly can, name by name, and then I'll talk a little bit about maybe who came out the best, who has the most work to do, and maybe the most shocking of the portal entries to this point. All right, so let's go over each of the portal names again. I think there's like 48 of them already so far. There obviously still could be more added in the next couple of weeks, but here we go. Dusty Stromer, Jun Suk Yo, Michael Ajayi, Will Johnson, Javon Porter, Matar Jope, Javon Ristic, Michael Ratai, Nate Kings, Parsa Fala, Elijah Fisher, Carter Benton, Solomon Omino, Amari Campbell, Burke Smith, Eddie Hedquist, Seth Jones, Mo Odom, Jackson Olvera, Austin Rapp, Messiah Oakman, Max McKinnon, Jenna Dubol, Vuk Massage, Bull Dangid, Wyatt Miller, Jude Harris, Todd Jones, Ashton Hardaway, Dangos Lungu, David Simon, Keon Webb, Chase Lulis, Jackson Gaffney, Benji Pierre, Keon Kenzie, Joey Chama, Stephen Jamerson, Colby Brooks, Tyrone Riley, Jason Rivera Torres, Christoph Tilley, Tyree Bryant, Koji Akametu, Luke McClelden, Nate Calmise, Isaiah Watts, and Marcus Wilson are all of the portal names. And obviously, as I was quickly going through those, I stumbled over a couple of the names, but the list is long. Well, it took me 56 seconds to get through all of them going at rapid fire, but no one was untouched. 11 teams in the WCC this past year, and all 11 of them have at least one player in the portal. St. Mary's was the one at this stage has been the least impacted, Ashton Hardaway being the only one, USF being second with 2, but one of them being very significant in Tyrone Riley. And obviously, the team who has the most work to do in this is Portland, because most of their roster hit the portal. And this is the second year in a row where we have seen this happen to Portland in a significant way. Again, Rapp, Oakman, McKinnon, Dubol, Massage, Dangit, Miller, Harris, Jones. They lost 9 players to the portal this year, and this is unfortunately a little bit of a trend for the Pilots. And that is something that has to change in the coming years in how they're building this team. And whether that be the NIL support, whether that be athletics in general, whether that be the coaching staff, something clearly is amiss when you have this many hit the portal in consecutive years. And it's not like there's not talent on this team. Like we've seen in the last couple of years, some of that talent go to bigger programs. We saw Harris last year go up to Washington with a deal up there. So it's not like that this team ends up with nobodies. There's talent. Portland has had some talent. They just haven't been able to put it together the last couple of years. And next year is going to just be one more big challenge for them. And San Diego's also on this list as far as big transfer classes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 for the Toreros, which is also another year of this happening for San Diego under Steve Lavin. So there's two teams right now that have really struggled to hold on to players in the portal. And right now, regardless of the reason, that has to change. And even though a ton of teams also get impacted by the portal, when you look around even the rest of the WCC, it's not like we're seeing mass exoduses from every team. Gonzaga, it's 2 rotation players in Stromer and Ajayi. Oregon State, it is 3 rotation players and it is like 3 starters, so that was a little bit larger of an impact. USF, 1 rotation player. St. Mary's, 1 rotation player. Washington State, 2 rotation players, albeit they only had about 7 guys who were even in their rotation. But you see the teams that are able to hold on to more of their pieces. And there's something to be said about the programs they have built, the teams that they have, and the culture that they also have on these squads. And of course, not going to discount the fact that they all have been supported well on the NIL front. That is another key part to all of that. So that is to say that clearly Portland and San Diego have work to do on that front. Even Pacific, to a lesser extent, is also going to have that. They lost Elijah Fisher to the portal. However, that's one player of their, and along with Burke Smith, 2 players that were in their rotation. So they didn't lose too much from the players that make an impact on that squad. Now, as far as most surprising, I mean, I think the most surprising has to be for me, it's surprising, but then it's not, is Tyrone Riley. Because he has ties to USF, his dad went to USF, because he went maybe not largely, but he was not a heavily recruited prospect, and USF was able to get him. He got an opportunity immediately. You would anticipate that going into next year, he was going to be given even more responsibility based on the fact that that was a senior heavy team. You think about that, like Marcus Williams won't be back, Malik Thomas won't be back, Dweedo Newberry won't be back. You have a lot of guys on that team that are going to not be returning, and Riley would step in as an immediate leader of that squad. Obviously, immensely talented kid, as we saw in year 1 on the hilltop. He's going to get a big deal from somebody, so I don't begrudge him for that. It's just that is maybe the more. Again, it's not surprising because of his talent and everything else, but at the same time, because of the connection that he has and the opportunity he was going to have at USF going into next year, that's where the surprise comes in, especially considering that one wasn't one of the early portal announcements. It was a bit of a delayed portal option. So he becomes the most surprising to me. And the team who came out the best so far, again, there's still time that things could change, but as of right now, it's almost the flip from a year ago, where St. Mary's was the team that probably was hurt by the exits the most, And now they are probably the team sitting the safest at this point. Ashton Hardaway being the one portal entry at this stage, and albeit I think he was going to have a greater opportunity next year. I thought he had grown a lot in his 1 year in Moraga. I thought that while he wasn't getting a ton of minutes, like you could clearly see that there was a role being built for him, and I think his opportunities late in the year really kind of, not to say vanished because of anything that he did, but I think it was largely more because of what we saw from the likes of Harry Wessels and the fact that they were able to go with that double big lineup a little bit more often. And that just cut into more of Hardaway's minutes. So I could see, like, if he's looking for a greater opportunity, an opportunity to start going into next year, going elsewhere would be the better bet. Because right now, you look at the way Seamers is constructed, I don't think he's going to have that opportunity, not as a starter anyway. The 3 is maybe the one spot that is available, Palace, because again, Morauskas, you would expect him to be back. Wessels will be back. So you have your 4 and 5. The 3 is the one that's open at the moment, and there's a number of guys who are probably going to be competing for time there, including Dylan Shaw, the freshman who is coming in, the highly touted freshman coming in, who is going to be a natural 3. But we don't see Randy Bennett use freshmen all too often early on. But so that 3 spot that Luke Barrett vacates is going to be an interesting option. And that could have been Ashton, but if he's looking for a guarantee, this was probably the best bet for him. But St. Mary's ends up, I think, looking the best coming back out of the portal, at least in this early stage. And looking at the context of what we saw, going back to the postseason and what we saw from these postseason teams, I think we got to see some for some up and down years, for some maybe some disappointing years, and for some maybe as expected years. So I'll start even with the team that is still yet to play and their season is not done. I'm going to start with Oregon State. And let's be honest, the expectations for Oregon State were low going into the year. They won 13 games all of last year. They lost a ton to the portal. They were a shell of what they once were a few years ago when they got to the Elite Eight. But looking in the totality of what Oregon State was able to do, they won 20 games. You saw the rise of Michael Rataj, who ended up being arguably one of the top candidates for WCC Player of the Year. They played a more entertaining brand of basketball than they had in a few years. They were good again. They weren't a team that you could just completely write off anymore. They defended the home court really well. They did still struggle on the road, but they picked up a win. They beat Gonzaga. They were able to beat Santa Clara. They beat UC Irvine. They had some good wins, and even like some of the losses that they picked up, narrowly losing to Oregon, narrowly losing to North Texas. They looked more like the best version of Oregon State as opposed to the worst version of Oregon State. And that's why, to me, like they were picked to finish 7th, I think it was, in the WCC. So they were picked to finish lower, and they ended up finishing 5th, a little higher than anticipated. They were a first round exit, or their first game exit in the WCC tournament, losing the Pepperdine. But overall, this feels like a B of a season. They were better. They were better than anticipated. There was growth on the roster, and it was a team that looked more the personality of Wayne Tinkle than the couple years prior. So the fact that they were better than expected, the fact that you saw some real good growth from some of the guys on that roster, all were positives of this season. Portal aside, that's a different conversation for a different day. But what Oregon State was able to do, to me, it's like that was a B. Like their season overall gets a B. that's where I would put the Beavers for the 2024-25 season. I'll go to Washington State because their season just ended on Monday as part of the college basketball crown. This is a team that they're top 20 in offensive efficiency. They were incredibly entertaining on that end of the floor. But the defense wasn't always there. They turned the ball over a ton. And injuries. It felt like the promise of the season early on was so high. They got out the gates hot. They picked up a couple of good wins. This Washington State team looked like they were in position to get into the bubble picture. And they were up until about the middle of December. And that's when it felt like it all started to catch up with the Cougars. The fact that they only had really 7 rotation guys, finally, it felt like it started to take its toll as we got deeper and deeper into the season. The turnovers were a problem for way too long into the season. And it's not like they were turning the ball over like 12, 13 times. They were turning the ball over 18, 19, 20 times a game. It made all of the positives of their offense be negated because they could not take care of the basketball. They weren't the best of rebounding teams. They weren't the greatest defensive team. There was a lot that they still needed to improve upon in this season. And because of this weird balance of they weren't great they were great offensively, but they kept turning the ball over, but they were banged up and they couldn't actually do much more than they could, but they also lost to Pacific twice. All of these factors coming in for Washington State, I feel like this is a team that if I'm not giving them an incomplete, which to an extent I feel like I should, it's a C+. It wasn't a bad year, but it wasn't a good year either. This was a team that felt like it still should have been better than it was because it kept beating itself. It kept beating itself with the high number of turnover games and then getting roasted on those turnovers. The fact that they weren't a great defensive team to begin with was a factor. And then when you add in the fact that they can't take care of the basketball, that's going to lose you a lot of games. And they were errors that were fixable. And toward the end of the year, it felt like that they were getting better at that. They were starting to take care of the basketball a little bit better, but it was too little too late. And that's why I think that Washington State gets a C+ to me. Now moving up to Santa Clara. The Broncos, the anticipation, the expectation was, at least internally, was to get back to the NCAA tournament, was to get there for the first time since the 90s. The talent was there. The schedule was there. I talked about this too. Everything was in place. The players were there. The roster, everything was there for Santa Clara to finally get over the hump and get back to the dance. But once again, they had those should-get games become a problem. Losses to LMU, to Stanford, to North Dakota State. All games that should not have been losses end up being quad 3 losses, and that was really the difference in their season. Because their quad 1, quad 2 record was probably good enough to get them into the conversation seriously. But those losses, which have happened year after year after year, hold this team back. And I talked about it all year long. I was like, the ceiling for that team was so high. But the floor was also really low. They would lose inexplicably to a team they shouldn't have lost to. I mentioned those three. I didn't even mention the fact that they lost to Pepperdine in the WCC tournament. The pieces were in place. They should have seriously competed for a spot in the NCAA tournament. There was even into February, there was still a conversation of an outside shot, but really it was they're going to have to run the table. They could not do it. They ended up in the NIT. They lost the second game there in a game in which they should have closed out as well. For many, it probably feels like a season of disappointment. Maybe a season where things should have gone differently, and there was no reason they should not have. And I think because of that, because of the ceiling, I'm not going to say like this completely buried, because to accomplish what Santa Clara still did is still something to be praised. They got back to the NIT. They were still in the picture. They won some really good games in the non-conference. They beat Gonzaga again. They did some impressive things throughout the course of the year. But it still left you feeling like they didn't do enough, that there was more that could have been done. And because of that, they get a B- for me for the season. Solid year, good year, but definitely could have been better. For USF, the Dons, honestly, they finished about where I thought they would end up. They lost Jonathan Mobo, which was a big, big loss. And I didn't think that there was a clear rise in talent that they brought in. Brought in Carlton Lingard, which was a good addition. You brought in you got another year of Ryan Beasley. You got another year of Malik Thomas. You got another year of Marcus Williams. You had at least a good core of guys returning that knew how to get to the postseason and were going to compete. And I think that was something that you look at USF over the last 7-8 years. They're well coached. They're talented. They know how to win the games that they're supposed to win, which was exactly what happened again this year. They won the games they were supposed to win. And they even won a couple of the games that added some icing to the cake. They went out and they beat Boise State early in the non-conference. They beat St. Mary's, which they hadn't done in a few years. But the resume still felt a little light. They didn't have enough of the marquee wins. They got one of them. Actually, again, only one of them ended up counting as a quad one. Even Boise's, as they started to slip and slip and slip, did not look nearly as good as it once did. They could have had the game against Bradley, didn't win that one. They could have beaten Loyola. They didn't get that one. They could have beaten Memphis. They didn't get that one. There was a lot of this close to getting a lot of these key wins. And that unfortunately has been a theme for USF the last couple of years. And this year, maybe I can say that it's different if they have Duito Newberry in some of those games. And I do think he would have made a significant difference. Obviously on the defensive end, he gives you a different look on the offensive end as well. You didn't get Ryan Beasley until he really wasn't himself until conference play, it felt like, as he was banged up a lot. So Barry Wang, Venabosi were both kind of thrust in the service maybe a little sooner than planned. But again, this team kind of finished about where I thought they would. I thought they were going to be in the 20-win plus category again. That's where they were. I didn't think they were quite good enough to get to the NCAA tournament. Turns out that was correct as well. They needed to show they can get some of the marquee wins. They did that a little bit. St. Mary's one being the biggest one of them. But they're still a step or so away from getting back to the NCAA tournament. they're on that cusp. They're knocking on the door, and because of that consistency, because they got right back to where I anticipated. Again, these are based off maybe my expectations of where I thought these teams would be. USF, this is a solid B. They did exactly what I thought they would do. They maybe did a tiny bit more than I thought, but they also didn't do enough to get out of that window, get out of that picture. This was a really good season again for USF. I know that it's not going to be any I know it's not going to be any there's no second prize, there's no consolation for their season. They obviously would have wanted to get back to the NCAA tournament, do better in the get a little further in the postseason. That's all the things they would have wanted to do. It didn't happen. But this year, it felt like this was about the ceiling for this squad, and so they get a B. That's where I have the Dons. Now for Gonzaga. Now remember at the beginning of the year, the expectations for Gonzaga were sky high. We were talking national championship. We were talking Final Four. We were definitely talking better than last year for a team that got to the Sweet 16. And that was because you brought back the entire core minus Anton Watson. You brought back Graham Ike. You brought back Ryan Nembhard. You brought back Ben Gregg, Nolan Hickman. You had another year of Dusty Stromer, Braden Huff. You added Caliph Battle and Michael Ajayi. This was a team that had unfinished business written all over it. They were top 10 in every poll. Everyone thought the Zags were going to be that team again this year. And then on opening night, they curb stomped Baylor. And it reinforced the idea of, oh, this Zag team is going to be that team again this year. And then as the non-conference went along, it left a lot of room for doubts. Losing the overtime game to West Virginia. Coughing up the 19-point lead against Kentucky and losing that one. Never really being in the game against UConn. Losing close to UCLA. Then got into conference play. Losing to Santa Clara. Losing to Oregon State. Twice to St. Mary's. Both the two regular season matchups. And while they remained top 10 in the metrics, KenPom, the Nets, all that, when you looked at the schedule, it didn't look nearly as impressive anymore. They lost the WCC by 3 games. And albeit they still won in Vegas for the auto bid, they ended up an 8 seed. They hammered Georgia, and then they ran into 1 seed of Houston, who was in the Final Four. And nearly came all the way back and won that game. Gonzaga felt like they did just enough to not be good enough all year long. Knocking on the door against UCLA, against West Virginia, against Kentucky, against Santa Clara, Oregon State, St. Mary's. They had opportunities to win all of these games, and they could not come through. And because of the expectations, because of where they were, that cannot be an unwritten part of the story. That this Gonzaga team, who had its Sweet 16 streak snapped, a Gonzaga team that did not win the WCC regular season title, a Gonzaga team that metrically did everything right except get the key wins that you needed to be seeded better and possibly get deeper into the tournament, albeit as we've seen throughout the course of the first 2 weekends, this has been a very chalky tournament, so maybe it would not have made that much of a difference anyway. But Gonzaga clearly had some flaws early on. It looked like that they had fixed at least some of them. But at the end of the day, it is their earliest exit in a decade from the tournament. It's a team that is going to look very different next year because of just transfers and just the senior heavy team that this group was. And because of the expectations, because of where we thought they would be, this grading wise, this is hard because this felt like a B- of a season. It was still a good season. They still got to the NCAA tournament. They still won a game in the NCAA tournament. They still did all these things. But the Zags have set their standard, have set their bar so high that just getting to the tournament isn't enough. Just winning a game isn't enough. This was a preseason top 10 team that did not get to the second weekend. And that is part of the story. And is why for the Zags overall, again, not taking anything away from how good they still were, especially at the end of the year. But you look at the season of totality. You look at what we thought they would be, what they ended up, and where they finished. It'd be hard pressed to give them any better than the B- that I'm putting them at. Now for St. Mary's. This one, again, based off of context and expectations. This was a team this time a year ago. Maybe give it a couple more weeks. They lost Aiden Mahaney. They lost Joshua Jefferson. They lost the associate head coach, Justin Joyner, which then was the domino to have Zion Sensley decommit from St. Mary's. Alex Dukas had graduated. They also lost Mason Forbes. This team was a shell of itself from a team that was a 5 seed, went to the NCAA tournament. Yes, lost in the first round to Grand Canyon, but now it's like, what do we do now? It was on the border of near full panic mode for the fandom. But it was, hold on, let's wait and see. Let's start to see how they fill in the gaps. And we started to see it. We started to, Palis Morauskas is added to the group. You see Luke Barrett start to develop and really kind of take hold of the 3 spot. You see Jordan Ross step into that role. You see Mikey Lewis really hit the ground running in non-conference play. But going into the year, we didn't know anything about that. We didn't know how good Mikey Lewis would be. We didn't know how good Palis Morauskas would be. We didn't know any of that. What we did know is that it was going to be different. And in fact, probably a lot of the expectations externally were kind of pulling it back a bit, because I definitely was. I didn't think that this team, based off of what we knew, would end up being better than the team from a year ago. This is a team that was younger, even though they had 3 key seniors in Saxon, Marshallonis, and Barrett. It was a group that still, I think, had something to prove. That loss against Grand Canyon left a bitter taste in their mouth. And it was almost, to an extent, addition by subtraction for this team, because even once the dust had settled after the Mahaney transfer, even I stopped, thought about it, and was thinking through it. This team is going to be, I think, better than they were with him, because there's no longer this up and down potential that a lot of times the roller coaster ride with Mahaney was. It became more consistent. The floor was raised. While the ceiling may not have been as high, the gap between the good and the bad was smaller than it had been a year ago. And we saw that. It was a team that went out and
picked up some good wins in the non-conference. Didn't get all of the wins that they probably would have wanted. They let the Boise State game slip away. They could have also had the game against Arizona State, but they beat Nebraska on a neutral site, which really was a road game. They beat Utah on the road. They went out. They torched the WCC even more than they did a year ago. Like, this was a team that won the league by 3 full games, regular season champions for the third straight year, second consecutive where it was a solo championship. They nearly swept all the team awards. This is a group of seniors that got to the NCAA tournament for the 4th straight time, first time in school history. And they checked off a lot of boxes of firsts. And they got to the NCAA tournament. They won a game in the NCAA tournament, advanced, which the team a year ago did not do. This team probably exceeded everyone's expectations except maybe their own. And while you could definitely point to some of the flaws that this team had as being like a top tier team, metrically, they turned into the defensive team we all know that they have been the last handful of years. The offense was more consistent. There were fewer ups and downs. This team had an identity, and a very defined identity. And you saw growth from a lot of the players. You saw Harry Wessels kind of come into his own. Luke Barrett turned into a guy who averaged only 11 minutes per game to averaging the most in the conference. It was a squad that did, I think, about as much as I think any of us could have ever hoped for as St. Mary's fans. And that's why I can't not give this team an A- for the year that they had. When you think about where they started, what the expectations were, and then where they ended, I think you can't not have them in that category, because they still did something that very few thought that they would be able to accomplish this year. And that is a 4th straight trip to the NCAA tournament, which is, again, I mentioned program record, 2nd straight outright WCC title, also the first time in school history. It did a lot. And it did a lot in the face of a very good Gonzaga team against some top tier in conference play. I mean, Santa Clara was good. USF was good. Oregon State was good. Washington State was not easy. The top half of the WCC was about as good as it ever has been. And despite all of that, St. Mary's still went out and won the league going away. And that's what makes what they did that much more impressive, is that you look at the rest of the league and what it did, the talent that was in this league, and they still went out and won. Now, throughout the course of the off season, we'll go dive into the portal. We'll talk a little bit about what each of these teams need to improve to be better next year. We will definitely get into Seattle as they start their transition into the WCC and what that's going to look like. A ton of rosters need to be refilled, so we'll get into that. A couple of the guys who have already kind of booked it and left. We know Javon Porter has committed to Missouri. Michael Ratai has committed to Baylor. Mo Odom has committed to Arizona State. So at least a few of the WCC names are going to be heading elsewhere. And plenty more to come as the offseason rolls on, as we start to wrap up the 2024-25 season. Obviously, the Final Four is still this weekend, so there will still be some basketball left. Oregon State does play tonight, so they have one left. Even if they're going to be missing their portal players, as Washington State did last night, this is going to be a lot of fun. It's going to be an interesting offseason as we go into what will be a very different, interesting, uneasy, a bunch of emotions are going to go into this WCC season, the 25-26 year. All right, well, that'll do it for this episode of the unofficial WCC Hoops podcast. For those who are done with basketball until November, thank all of you for following along, engaging with me on social, watching the podcast. It's a lot of fun to do this, and you guys all make it that much better. So be sure to follow on social media. We'll be continuing all the content throughout the course of the non-conference. The podcast will still be running all throughout the summer, all throughout the non-conference as well, or the off-season, I should say. And we will be back in full force, obviously, in September, October, going into November, but we'll still roll on. There'll still be basketball to talk about. We'll talk about the NBA and the prospects there. We'll talk about Summer League and the WCC guys that are going to be playing in that. We'll talk about how these rebuilt rosters are going to look and how they project out into next season. We'll talk more in depth about Seattle. We'll get into all of it. But once again, for those who are going to be checking out for the season, thanks all of you one more time for joining us, for following, for subscribing, for all of it. This is a lot of fun to do. You make it worth it to do it. And with that, thanks for watching, everybody, and I will hopefully catch you all throughout the summer.